Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
Smell of the lake. If Betty wasn't working, then maybe she could have smiled, but she was working and there was no reason to smile. Betty stopped walking and dug her feet into the soft muddy ground as she stared out over the large lake. She kept staring, studying every little detail of the lake, from the thick groups of trees that lined the edges of it with their large roots digging into the water, to the sheer glassy stillness of the water. The air was perfectly calm and cold, freezing in fact. Betty wanted to pull her thick fake fur coat over her more to keep her warm, but that would take some of her attention away. She couldn't have that. She had no idea how big the lake was, but considering this was Leybourne Lakes in Kent, England, and one of 4. Betty had a suspicion it was easily the size of a football pitch. The perfect place to hide a body. Well, Betty wasn't sure how true that fact was, but as she listened to the spooky calmness of it all, with only the main road and cars rushing past in the far distance, Betty knew no one would find a body for days. Especially as all the sailing, swimming, and everything else that happened on the lake had been cancelled for the winter months. So Betty raised an eyebrow as she realized a body could easily remain here for another 3 months until April. But by that time Betty had no idea what would be left of the body, maybe the chest and a head, but even they would be badly rotten by then. Betty had to find the body. Her drive only increased as Betty remembered all the tears and crying and screaming she heard from the mother of a lost boy, Alex Malt, who ran away from home after a massive argument. Betty still couldn't believe the story of how the mother had lost a finger. Some sort of farming accident. The parents didn't agree with the son hanging out with certain people because they were too posh for the family. They weren't. They made Betty seem like the queen, but the parents hated them anyway. At first Betty had no idea if she would take the case or not, because the mother said outright she couldn't pay Betty. But she was a sucker for a mother in need, so she agreed, fully intending to get paid from the mother afterwards. Or Betty had a suspicion her cop friend, boyfriend, whatever he was, Graham, could find something on the mother. Staring at the lake, Betty found this all strangely peaceful, with the sun starting to set and shining a gently orange beam on the glassy water. Betty had no idea how to find the body. She hadn't done this before, but she had to try. After investigating for a few days, Betty had tracked Alex's past whereabouts to friends and drug dealers, and well, Betty started to understand that this new group of friends weren't the ones causing Alex any harm. Alex seemed to know that, so he made these new friends, got clean and left his old friends. Betty wanted to smile, but didn't feel like she had in it her when she remembered how one of the posh, compared to his family friends, had said Alex wanted to become a doctor now. A future only possible now he had left his old friends, and a future worth living. A part of Betty knew the mother and old friends knew Alex was getting a better life, and wanted a life worth living with these new influences. But she still couldn't understand why they didn't support him. Alex was happy. His teachers said a lot happier than he's been in years. So the idea of his friends and family not supporting him made no sense to her at first. Then as she talked to them more and more, Betty realized they were all connected to the local drug rings around Kent and London, and they apparently needed Alex. Betty didn't find anything quite connecting the mother to it all, but Graham probably could. After all that, Betty partly didn't want to find Alex. She actually considered calling it quits and letting Alex escape it all. But one question kept pounding in her mind. What if he was in trouble? The second Betty realized that she was back on her laptop, and managed to find a street camera showing Alex going into Leybourne Lakes, but he never left. Remembering the suicide awareness classes from Private Icon, Betty felt her stomach twist as she realized she needed to come to the lake, and she hoped she was wrong. Returning her attention back to the lake, Betty felt her stomach twist into an even tighter knot. She had to find him now. Betty was about to walk off and follow the muddy ring path around the lake, when the cold wind picked up. She gagged. Covering her nose, Betty gagged as the overwhelming smell of rotten flesh came over her. She couldn't smell anything else, not her perfume, not the fresh lake air. Everything stunk of rotten flesh. Tears started to stream down Betty's face, as the smell kept growing and growing in intensity. She hadn't smelt anything like it before. This was far worse than rotten eggs. Maybe 1,000,000 times worse. A tiny part of Betty wanted to leave and never return, but she had to find the body, and she knew her clothes would be smelling of dead body for months. She frowned at the idea of having to get rid of her clothes. Betty had only bought the fur coat yesterday. Betty's eyes narrowed as she tried to think about where the smell was coming from. Considering she had only smelt it when the cold wind started to blow, she deduced it was coming from ahead of her. Turning around, Betty started to walk along the soft muddy path that went around the lake, but with each step the smell of rotten flesh got worse and worse. She was definitely getting hazard pay. After 20 steps, Betty was forcing her eyes to stay open, but even then her vision was so blurry she could barely see. She was also fairly sure she'd only be able to smell odor de dead body for weeks to come. After a few more seconds of walking, the smell started to drop in intensity and Betty smiled a little. Her eyes became slightly clearer, and she was certain she had just missed the body. Walking closer to the edge of the muddy path, Betty's eyes narrowed as she focused on all the twisted muddy roots of the trees. Large chunks of plants stuck out of the mud, and Betty was sure the mud would have smelt disgusting. But only the smell of rotten flesh filled the air. Her eyes covered each and every centimeter of the muddy edge of the lake, but she couldn't see anything. Betty felt her stomach tighten even more. She wondered if her stomach was about to burst. She couldn't give up. Betty had to find that body. Knowing she was going to have to throw her clothes out anyway, Betty took a few steps off the muddy path and stood on the edge of where the muddy lake met the shore. Her black high heels sunk into the mud slightly, but Betty couldn't care less. Betty's eyes kept scanning until she saw exactly what she didn't want to see. About 2 meters from her was a little bunch of hair exposed with something much larger covered in mud. The smell couldn't get any stronger now, as Betty's nose felt as if it was dying from the intense odor de dead body. Betty knew with 100% certainty she shouldn't have done what she was about to do, but she did it anyway. She walked further into the mud, her body sinking until she was waist-deep in mud. She could feel the suction of the mud form around her, and her high heels broke on sharp rocks, but in that moment she didn't care. Reaching out, Betty's little hand touched the little bunch of hair. It felt freezing and wet, and Betty pushed some of the mud away from the person's face. She was surprised it was so easy, but after a minute or two of pushing away the mud, she thought she was almost going to collapse as the worst, most intense wave of odor de dead body hit her. Once she regained her composure, she stared at the young, smooth face of Alex Malt. Betty gently rubbed his freezing cold, deadly pale cheek with her hand. No one should ever have to deal with this, and Betty wasn't going to let any of his family and friends get away with this. It was their fault he'd killed himself. All Alex had wanted was a better life, and they didn't love or support him. Outrageous. As Betty rubbed his cheek a final time, her eyes widened as she saw his cold, lifeless eyes move slightly. A memory of a class at Private Icon came into her mind. It was something about a smashed skull, and the brain pressed against the eye. So without really knowing what she was doing, Betty took a careful step closer to the body, and stuck her hand into the freezing mud, and she pressed her fingers against the back of his head. Betty gasped as the skull moved and cracked ever so slightly. She couldn't believe what she was feeling. Her mouth dropped as she took her cold hand out of the mud and wiped it clean. She couldn't believe someone had actually killed him. Someone had killed Alex Malt. Why? She couldn't believe it. Why on earth would someone want to kill anyone so kind, and only wanted a better life for themselves. Remembering not to panic as she slipped out of the mud to combat the suction power, Betty took out her slightly muddy phone and called the only person who could help her. "Hi Bet," Graham started. "Graham, I have a body for you." Sitting on the cold, slightly frozen grass with a blanket wrapped round her, Betty took slow deep breaths as columns of vapor formed in front of her. She suspected herself to be shivering, but she was glad she wasn't. As Betty focused on the large shingle car park packed full of police cars and even some black cars she didn't recognize, Betty's eyes focused on the group of white-covered crime scene techs who pushed Alex's body into the coroner van. That simple fact still left Betty in shock. Her entire body felt cold and numb. Of course that could have just been from the cold, but it didn't make Betty feel any easier. The sounds of cars driving past, police officers talking and the gentle wind howling made Betty feel useless and unwanted as she sat there waiting to be released. A part of her knew she could go home whenever she wanted, because Graham would cover for her anyway. Yet Betty didn't feel like going home anyway. She didn't want to have to tell the mother her findings. After a few moments, Betty smiled as her handsome, fit boyfriend Graham walked over with his stunning smile and longish brown hair parted perfectly to the left. He was beautiful and utterly perfect. What Betty couldn't have given in that moment just to kiss him. When Graham sat next to Betty, she loved the smell of his rich, earthy aftershave that reminded her of Sunday dinners with her family. "Yeah, still shouldn't have gone in the mud, Bet," Graham said. Betty playfully hit him. "You have your crime and we need to solve it." Graham's eyes narrowed. "Bet, this is a police investigation, not a Betty investigation." Betty rolled her eyes and took out her phone, bringing up security camera footage of both the lake's entrances. "Where did you get that?" Graham asked. Betty smiled. "You can get the footage through your methods, I'll get it with my methods." Graham smiled and rested his chin on Betty's shoulder. Betty loved the feeling of his body warmth. "Now, when I was finding Alex, I only checked the camera towards the houses, probably because at the time I was only looking for him." "Okay. But if we look at the other camera towards here, the car park, we can fast forward it," Betty said as she fast forwarded the footage for the past few days. As it was January, there weren't many people. Only the crazy runners, who thought it was a brilliant idea to go running in shorts in freezing conditions. Betty stopped the footage. "What is it?" Graham asked. Betty zoomed in on the footage when she saw a tall middle-aged woman wearing a black coat. She could have sworn it was the mother, so Betty zoomed in on the woman's fingers and the picture was blurry, but a finger was almost certainly missing. "That's Alex's mother," Betty said. "But ya said ya were hired to find him." "I know. But why hire ya if she found him?" That was the question, and Betty didn't have an answer in the slightest. Graham gave her a quick kiss and ran off in his police car. Betty looked around but everyone was gone. There was no one to take her home. Some thanks. As Betty returned to the lakes the next day, admiring their stunning beauty as the large lake churned and returned to life with swans swimming about and talking with each other, she couldn't help but smile. Leybourne Lakes might not have been the most sought-after lakes to see in Kent or the UK, but they had their own special beauty to them. Even the soft muddy path wasn't that bad after all. The mud had hardened to create a harsh bumpy landscape for Betty to walk across. She still loved it compared to yesterday. The air was still chilling her as she breathed it in, but Betty preferred it. Yesterday the cold was just annoying and bitter, yet today it seemed to be refreshing and revitalizing. Betty didn't know why she felt so good. It could have been because she had helped to catch a killer or some other reason. Listening to the sound of swans talking and splashing and people walking, chatting and laughing, Betty couldn't believe the difference a simple day can make in the lakes. Betty breathed in the chilling fresh air with hints of fresh pine that reminded her of delicious roasted lamb on holidays to the New Forest as a child. She knew that was probably her favorite difference for today. She frowned as she remembered throwing away her clothes after yesterday. Her fake fur coat was binned along with the rest of it. Betty hated throwing it all away, but it wasn't like she had a choice. They smelt horrific. Taking a step closer to the cold water's edge, Betty smiled as she finally got what she wanted. She had to admit, she was surprised when she got the phone call from Graham earlier in the morning that he had arrested the mother for Alex's murder. She confessed to the entire thing, and just as Betty had suspected, it all was about drugs. It turned out the entire family and friendship group was some gang that supplied weed and stronger drugs all across Kent and London. Then Alex met these new people, wanted a better life and left the family. Betty shook her head as she remembered what Graham had told her next. It surprised her the mother was the gang leader, and killed her own son to send a message across the gang and county that no one messes with or leaves the gang. But Betty loved the best part of it all, and she definitely needed to make Graham feel appreciated later. Apparently, he had found a pile of cash with Betty's name on it as payment when they arrested her. Of course, Betty knew he was probably lying. She knew the mother was never going to pay her. But considering how risky it was for Graham, Betty knew he cared about her and probably loved her. That meant a lot. It didn't mean she wanted him to do it again. But another $1,000 in the bank account is hardly something to moan about. Turning around and walking back along the cold, muddy path back to her car, Betty wondered what would have happened if Alex was allowed to simply live out his life and become what he wanted. Maybe he would have saved lives as a doctor. Maybe he would have become an office worker in some company and developed something, or maybe. Betty didn't know. But that didn't matter. What did matter was that other children and vulnerable teens could have some sort of meaningful life. Betty rolled her eyes as she promised herself that she would keep at least £200, as she honestly needed that for food and living stuff. But the rest of the money, she didn't need that, and if this case had taught her anything, it was how badly other people needed it. Betty knew of a few charities that would use the money properly, so that's where it would go. Betty would make sure of that when she got back home. After a few minutes of walking, Betty got back to her car and placed a hand on the cold plastic door handle. Before she pulled it, Betty took one final breath and smiled at the beautiful freshness of the smell of the lake. It was a stunning smell, so fresh, so full of life, so perfect. And Betty had done her job. The crime was solved, the money was paid, and the smell of the lake was gone.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help us spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Whiteleyverse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.